Welcome to another episode of TimeShift America. Where are we off to today as we take a virtual road trip back through time? Let's enter the server room and decipher our latitude and longitude. And today it is latitude 43 degrees 3 minutes and 47 seconds north, with a longitude of 83 degrees 51 minutes and 44 seconds west. We are zooming in to mid-Michigan and the small Genesee County town of Flushing, situated about 10 miles northwest of Flint. We are along the railroad tracks at the western end of Main Street and looking at the magnificent Flushing train depot. Built in 1888, the train depot is now a museum to times past. Seems like an entirely appropriate location to go back in time and bring history to life. Back to the 1800s, when the age of steam rolled into Flushing. About 50 years before the locomotives arrived into this small town, several early settlers planted their roots in Flushing. The settlement was ideally located along the Flint River. The river would provide the water to power the various mills that were to be constructed along the river's banks. These mills would grind wheat for flour and cut lumber for construction. With the Indian cession of the Saginaw Valley in 1819, one of the many one-sided Indian treaties negotiated by Michigan's first territorial governor, Lewis Cass, tracts of land were now available for purchase. Land north of Flint was a hot item, as settlers were desiring to find fertile land at a good price. Some of these early settlers were from England. In a journal entry from the time it is noted, John Evans from Manchester, England, emigrated to the United States in 1830, initially spending 5 years in New York. He then moved with his daughter to Flushing, the trip occupying 3 weeks and that portion of it from Detroit forward being made on foot. Imagine that. 3 weeks getting from New York to Detroit and then having to walk 70 miles north to your new home. Many early pioneers came to the territory of Michigan from New York State by way of the steam-powered boats chugging along the newly built Erie Canal. Opening in 1825, the Erie Canal allowed for the flow of people from the East Coast to the Great Lakes region by way of the water, which at the time was the cheapest and most convenient way to travel. Michigan fever was fueled by an abundance of affordable and available land. Here, a German newspaper ads encouraged Germans to consider starting a new life in Michigan. A rapidly growing population in the territory of Michigan made it possible to apply for statehood in 1835. That is when President Jackson had to step in and settle a dispute between Michigan and Ohio. The dispute centered around a strip of land known as the Toledo Strip. As the name implies, it included the city of Toledo and its precious Great Lakes access. President Jackson brokered the deal where Ohio got Toledo and access to Lake Erie, and Michigan would get the western Upper Peninsula. Meanwhile, as settlers were flocking to mid-Michigan, a couple of industrious pioneers arrived on the scene. It was the year 1836 when Charles Seymour from New England and Horace Jerome from New York laid claim to the area that would eventually become the village of Flushing, named after Flushing on Long Island, New York. Together they operated a mill and lumber company. Jerome would later establish the Flint Rapids Bank, a wildcat bank that didn't last long. It failed in less than a year. In the end, the money wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. Horace Jerome left the area and was never seen in these parts again. While he was running from the failed bank's angry customers, his youngest brother David, Howell Jerome, would later go on to become Michigan's 18th governor in 1881 to 1883. Later, he was appointed to President Benjamin Harrison's Cherokee Commission, also known as the Jerome Commission, a federal agency whose main goal was to obtain as much Indian land as possible in order to construct railroads across America. Another celebrated Flushing resident was Cornelia Moots. Born in Flushing in 1843, her father was a firm believer in the abolition of slavery. He became part of the Underground Railroad, opening up the family home in Flushing to slaves seeking freedom in the North. Young Cornelia grew up to be an early activist for women's rights and campaigned for the prohibition of alcohol. She worked on behalf of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and women's suffrage. In 1892, the Sheboygan Democrat newspaper referred to her as an interesting and forcible speaker. However, not interesting enough apparently for the Flushing crowd. Moots packed up and moved to the Jackson area and studied at Albion College, where she became revered for her beliefs and fiery sermons. She was a star in the women's movement and was soon appointed to represent the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the Philippines, caring for soldiers during the Spanish-American War, urging the use of non-alcoholic remedies. In 1901, the New York Tribune printed an article where Mrs. Moots was requesting letters be sent to the injured soldiers in her care. In particular, soldiers that didn't receive any letters, those whose lives are forlorn and desolate, because they are rarely touched by acts of kindness. By 1833, the first railroad tracks were being laid in Michigan. The railroad construction boom then went into high gear. Most of the early tracks followed an east-west trajectory. By the 1870s, we start seeing the railroad companies heading into northern Michigan. Until the railroads arrived in the state, the only means of transportation was horse and wagon. Time-consuming at the best of times, and others, downright impossible. Before the railroads, travel between Detroit and Chicago took about a week in good weather. By train, it took less than a day. The decades of the 1850s, 60s, and 70s witnessed the building of churches, schools, a bank, a fire department, even an opera house, all things a successful town needed. And in 1873, the Flushing Ladies Association was formed. Mother Moots would have been proud. However, it would still take another half-century for the federal government to finally grant women the right to vote. With about 700 residents, Flushing officially became a village on March 21st, 1877. A decade later, in 1888, Flushing was figuratively ready to connect with the world. The track starts in Durand and terminates in Saginaw, a relatively short run at about 40 miles, but what it lacks in distance, it makes up in benefit to its surrounding communities. Towns along the lines now had quick direct access to the Great Lakes steamers. Commodities could be loaded onto these vessels and shipped around the Great Lakes and beyond. No question, railroads transformed mid-Michigan's economy by making it easier to distribute the state's timber, minerals, livestock, and crops. Several cities in Michigan became hubs for the railroad business: Durand, Owasso, Saginaw, and Kalamazoo. Durand is located just 15 miles southwest of Flushing, and was the originating point for the tracks that are the subject of today's TimeShift. Durand was the busiest rail hub outside of the Detroit Central Station. In its heyday, it saw 42 passenger trains, 22 mail trains, and 78 freight trains daily. The railroad was good to Durand. Its population ballooned as the rail traffic increased. In fact, from 1890 to 1900, just 10 years, the U.S. Census indicates the town's population went from 255 to over 2,000. 50% of those people working for the railroad companies. Its distinctive Witch's Hat Depot, designed by renowned Detroit architects Frederick H. Speyer and William C. Rones, is still standing to this very day and is a museum to Michigan's rich railroading history. Construction of the Durand to Saginaw line didn't start off very well. There was much debate between two towns as to where the tracks for the Flushing line ought to originate: Durand or the town a few miles to the east, Duffield. The dispute caused so much confusion that when the construction began on July 29, 1887, the Owasso Times reported that the crews had started laying the track, but were going in the wrong direction. The surveyor hired a rig and started out after them, but failed to find them. Another man went searching and found them in a swamp near Flushing. The workers returned to base camp and started over. Railroad designers like straight lines. They're easier and more cost-effective to build. Geographically, Flushing was several miles off of a direct path line between the two cities. The less than straight Flushing Railroad meant that the tracks would pass through more than just the two counties of Shiawassee and Saginaw. It would now include Genesee County, meaning more work for local trackmen and revenue for the local government. One railroad executive eloquently described the proposed route as no straighter than an elbow. Durand finally won the dispute, and Flushing was included in the route, elbow and all. The Flint River once again proved to be an asset to the small town, as an ideal location to refill the steam engine's boilers with water and pick up valuable commodities from the mills and stores. A train station in your town was beneficial for the local community. Like the freeway exits of today, the real estate values increase as travelers exit looking for food, drink, supplies, and a good time. The railroad finally reached Flushing in July 1888. On Monday, December 17th, 1888, the first passenger train arrived into town from Saginaw. A frequent traveler on the trains was a man by the name of Joe Gage, the first person of color to serve in the fire department of the mid-Michigan town of Ithaca. In fact, his name is among those etched in stone as one of the town's earliest first responders. In 1912, the train brought the son of former slaves into Flushing to fight, not a fire, but in the ring. You see, Joe was a local boxing legend, and with boxing having just become legal in the state of Michigan, he was invited to fight in a main event in Flushing. After the Friday night fights, Joe was running late and missed the last train home. He spent the weekend in Flushing, and the weekend turned into a lifetime. Joe Gage fell in love with this mid-Michigan town, and this mid-Michigan town fell in love with Joe. He was the town's first resident of color, a boxing gym owner, the town's fire chief, a barber, an opera singer, and a civic leader. Joe became entrenched in this community. Joe Gage, known as a man of integrity, who amplifies the adventurous spirit of those early days in small-town America, so much so that in 1954, having just retired from his barber shop, local leaders wanted to celebrate Joe's 87th birthday with a little party. Well, that party turned into the biggest celebration the town had ever seen. It is reported that over 1,300 people came to honor the man and his life full of achievements. While giving a speech to the crowd, he is quoted as saying, "If I ever have it all to do over again, I'd like to change only one thing. I'd like to be born with white skin. I just keep wondering what it would have been like. I'm not finding fault. I'm just curious. But if I couldn't change it, and if I have it all over again, I'd make tracks for Flushing just as fast as I could. God bless you, everyone." Joe died 2 years later, on March 6th. He was laid to rest next to his wife, Flushing Cemetery. From the earliest settlers that walked the final 70 miles of their journey, to those that came by the power of steam on boats and on trains, we witness the industrious businessmen and their families laying tracks of history, from progressive social movements where a woman cares for wounded soldiers a world away, to new forms of entertainment featuring the much-loved Joe Gage and his colorful life. This little town is the epitome of early Midwest America. And so as we time shift back, from 1890 to today, we're bringing history to life on Time Shift America.